There's a new video game adaptation movie that's just come out in theaters and on Peacock, day and date, and it's a movie. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to be talking about one of the latest adaptations of a very popular video game, and that is Five Nights at Freddy's. Directed by Tammi and starring people like Josh Hutcherson, Piper Rubio, Elizabeth Lail, Matthew Lillard, Mary Stuart Masterson, and more. Five Nights at Freddy's is the latest adaptation of a popular worldwide success known as Five Nights at Freddy's that takes a very simple premise, and now we have a movie. So when I first heard we were going to be getting a Five Nights at Freddy's movie, I was pretty excited because I've always thought that those games were so cool and clever for something that was so simplistic. I've only ever played the first two Five Nights at Freddy's, if I'm completely and utterly honest. I know there's a few others that I haven't played, but I have seen some of the gameplay, with it still being a lot of the base structure of the gameplay with just some add-ons. And for anybody who is unfamiliar with what Five Nights at Freddy's is all about, the base premise of the video game is just essentially you staring at security cameras, turning your head to a couple of entryways that some of these animatronics could come through, and I guess I should explain the animatronics as well, but you're pretty much just trying to detect them so that they don't attack you, so it doesn't lead to a jump scare where they pop into the screen and scare you. Five Nights at Freddy's takes place in a pizzeria that's very similar to something like Chuck E. Cheese, or if you grew up in South Florida like I did, Dandy Bears, where essentially you have this, kid kind of arcade location that has a band on stage made up of a bunch of animatronics. And in the case of Five Nights at Freddy's, it's a rundown iteration of one of those where these creatures come to life at night. And in the video game, you are a security guard. And again, like I mentioned earlier, you're just staring at computer screens, checking where they are on these various security cameras, as well as the entrance ways that they can come into this room. And that's pretty much it. You keep your eye on the computer screens, you keep an eye on those entrances, and there's nothing more to the game. So I was excited about the idea of them making a movie because I thought they could do a lot of really cool things with it, whether it be in the security approach as they do with this movie, but also just in this idea of being able to do something creepy and eerie with this, Chuck E. Cheese come to life idea. Because let's be completely and utterly honest, I think part of what made these games so successful, not only with kids but also with adults, is that creepy premise. I think we've all thought about the horrible idea of being stuck in a Chuck E. Cheese or something like that at night and those animatronics coming to life. And they were able to just take that premise, slap it into a video game that's incredibly simplistic, and it became this worldwide success that would spawn supplemental material. I believe there's lore that you can find online. I think there's even like comic strips or books. I could be wrong on that, but there are multiple games. And so all that to say, I just love that they were making this movie. And then I saw the trailer. I thought, okay, it looks like fun. It didn't necessarily look like it was going to be the greatest movie or anything like that. It looked like similar to the games. It was going to be something that was, a little bit more horror light, if you will, something that could be an entry-level horror film for kids that are 11 to 15. And what I'll say about this movie is it is that in a lot of ways. This is definitely a horror movie for, you parents who want to have your kids watch something spooky for the spooky season that, is very light on the horror side of things. Something that middle school kids could watch and maybe get a little bit spooked out at, but nothing overly scary. Now, as somebody who grew up watching horror as a young kid because my mom would always let me watch things during the Halloween season, I'm a pretty seasoned horror fan, and I think most people who are seasoned horror fans, whether they're, younger than me or older than me, are going to just find this to be a pretty middle-of-the-road, kind of lackluster horror film. Even if I was back in the age of like 13 years old, I think I would have felt this way about the movie. After having checked out Five Nights at Freddy's, which I actually watched on Peacock, I didn't watch it in theaters. I was going to see it in theaters a couple of days ago, but then I had some things to do, and so I ended up just deciding to wait to watch it today. I was going to go to the theaters, then I saw that Peacock released it day and date, the same day as they released it in theaters, so I figured, hey, let me just check it out at home in the comfort of my own home. And I'm glad I did, to be completely and utterly honest, because Five Nights at Freddy's for me was a big letdown. I found the movie to be very well made in a lot of ways, and there are some things I definitely want to lean into when it comes to my positives, but quite frankly, something that I just felt was unnecessarily over convoluted in ways. Never where it's, not something you can follow, but ultimately it takes a simple premise from the game and just adds so much more that just didn't need to be in this movie, that just left me not caring about where the story was going. And honestly, on an overall level, when it comes down to the script and the screenplay here, whether it be poor character logic, things that often happen, like character deaths that are just breezed over and never referenced, or just things that flat out didn't really connect to what this game was all about and ultimately just felt kind of random within this movie, I ultimately just found the movie to be a letdown, and I found myself bored for majority of the runtime. But I mentioned there are some positives, and I think the biggest positives I can give this film are the performances, which I do think are solid throughout, as well as the cinematography and the lighting. There is a great sense of atmosphere, which is one of my favorite things about the Five Nights at Freddy's games. There's a great sense of atmosphere attached to this simplistic gameplay style, this simplistic premise, and it's the atmosphere and the jump scares that make those games effective for what they are. And so you kind of just needed a just straightforward jump scare kind of movie in a lot of ways with this movie, something that could just have been a straightforward cookie cutter horror film, but it just didn't have that for me overall. But going back to the positives, I found that the atmosphere was solid in terms of the lighting and the look of the film. I think the performances, as I mentioned, were pretty solid. And I really enjoyed a lot of the practical effects that were put into this because, of course, you have animatronic animals, and they do utilize a great sense of costume design and set design and practical animatronics to bring these creatures to life, or to bring, Freddy Fazbear and the rest of his friends to life, which I really enjoyed. As a film buff and as somebody who just grew up loving seeing costume design and animatronics and different things like that bring movie magic to life, there are some really cool things here on display when it comes to the actual animatronics and the fact that at times there are people in suits. So I guess, again, the whole costume element of the film, really enjoyed that. I thought the production design and production value of the film overall was pretty solid. But where this movie just completely lost me was in its narrative. It was in its script and its nonsensical kind of over-the-top elements. I've been rambling here a little bit about just what I flat out didn't like, but let's talk about what this movie's about, as it focuses on the character of Mike, played by Josh Hutcherson, who is this guy who had a traumatic memory from when he was a child, where he was essentially watching over his brother, and his brother ends up being kidnapped. This ends up bringing his family into disarray, and then we jump to the future where we see Josh Hutcherson as he's taking care of his young sister, Abby, played by Piper Rubio, and he isn't really well off. He doesn't have a lot of money. He's struggling to keep jobs. He's not necessarily the most responsible guy, but he's trying to care for his sister. His parents have passed away, and he's struggling consistently with this memory of what happened to his brother, and he struggles to sleep, so he takes sleeping pills, and when he goes to sleep, he tends to try to relive that memory in his dreams to try to see if he can pick up on details that he missed, so he can try to uncover what actually happened to his brother. And over the course of the film, this is a consistent storyline. This is part of one of the main driving forces for this character. And so while you have the element of him taking on this job to go and be a security officer at night at Freddy Fazbear's, and of course you have the element where the animatronics start to come to life, and I won't get too much into it because I don't want to get into spoilers or anything like that. It ultimately, beyond the straightforward premise of creepy robot animals, now you have this whole storyline where he's essentially dream-walking consistently. It felt like something out of Nightmare on Elm Street, where throughout the course of the film, every night or even during the day, whenever he decides to take a nap or take some sleeping pills, and he's on the job, off the job, whatever the case may be, this dude is consistently just reliving the same memory, trying to find answers about what happened to his younger brother. And this just, for me, at a certain point in the film, felt like it was just detracting from what we're actually watching, which is a Five Nights at Freddy's movie. It has nothing at all to do with what this franchise has ever been about in terms of the games, and ultimately just detracted from any of the creep factor from the movie. And I found myself finding less and less moments where I cared as we had gone into the fourth, fifth, or sixth dream sequence of him reliving the same memory over and over again. And not too long into him becoming a security officer at this pizzeria, we're introduced to Vanessa, a police officer played by Elizabeth Lail, who kind of just randomly shows up in the story. And I don't want to get too deep into spoilers because there are some things that go on with her character, but ultimately I kind of found her to be a bit of a just random character at times that it really isn't until the end that her importance isn't really clear to us. And throughout the course of the film, she's just kind of felt like a very just random thrown in character. It didn't really feel like she was a natural piece of the story, again, until you get to the end and there are things that are revealed that you kind of have a different outlook on her character. But quite frankly, I just didn't really care for her character's involvement in the story, and more often than not, the lines of dialogue she would say would just kind of leave me like, what is she even talking about? And sure, again, there are some things that are answered, but I just genuinely, when I look back on the film, having just watched it, I just feel like a lot of what they did with her character was really uninteresting, and that's where this movie just kind of fell flat for me. Ultimately, this was an uninteresting take on Five Nights at Freddy's. You know, I'd much rather just play the game. The games are scarier, they're creepier, they have a greater sense of atmosphere, and watching the movie, I was just hoping to feel a little bit of that, you know, and there just wasn't a whole lot of that. Again, I really appreciated the costume design and the set design and the, you know, the animatronic work and all the stuff that went into the practical elements. But I just think when it came down to the story, they took what was a really simple premise and just made it a little bit more convoluted than it needed to have been. Never incapable of being followed, but just kind of made me scratch my head as to thinking, why was this the story that they created for this movie based on this game? Like, what did they see in the video game that made them want to do this with the movie? It just didn't really make much sense to me, and ultimately it just made for a bit of a lackluster experience. I just never found myself attached to the characters, their journey, or their drive. I know the movie's called Five Nights at Freddy's and the whole thing is about a security camera element to it, which I would have been interested in seeing and maybe making it where every night it gets a little crazier for our security individual. But adding in this dream element and this whole like thing, he is like living with this guilt about his younger brother, that it just while it is part of the story, it just felt kind of just dull. It just felt dull and boring. It didn't really feel like it added to the Five Nights at Freddy's element of the movie. And by the time the movie came to a close, I was like, what a wasted opportunity, quite frankly. From what I hear, the movie is doing fairly decently with, you know, younger audience members and just decently at the box office. So, you know, maybe if we get another one, they could do something a little bit more interesting. But quite frankly, I just feel like they should have just gone something a little bit more horror, to be completely and utterly honest. They should have like leaned into it a little bit more. Made it something that, you know, still younger people can go see. I'm okay if the film's like a PG-13 horror film. I get it. Like, the main demographic of the games are younger people. But at this point, since it's been so long since Five Nights at Freddy's came out and it was so popular back when, even when I was younger, like, you know, somewhere within the last decade of time, I feel like people who have played it are at least now in their 20s or in their early 30s. And, you know, it just kind of seems weird to like just solely make it something that was just so kind of just for younger audience members, when a lot of people who played it when it was really popular initially have grown up and are now adults. But, you know, anyway, I feel like I'm rambling at this point. Five Nights at Freddy's for me was just not what I was hoping it would be. I think, again, there are some really good filmmaking elements in here, but it just ultimately, narratively, was just dull to me, and I don't necessarily see this being a standout in people's minds when we get to the end of the year, even though we did have some solid performances and some awesome elements about the movie. Just not a memorable story. So a big thanks to you guys for watching. Hit that like button if you guys enjoyed the video. Comment down below and let me know what you guys thought about Five Nights at Freddy's. Did it live up to the expectation for you? Whether you're a fan or not of the games, let me know your thoughts. Definitely want to hear the various opinions. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of opinions for this film, whether there's from people who enjoy these games or people who don't enjoy these games or people who don't even know anything about this game. Whatever the case may be, again, thank you so much for watching. Comment down below and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.